A dollar, a pound, and a yen are all just pieces of paper with numbers printed on them. So why is one worth more than another? It seems like someone just sat in a room one day and decided, picked numbers out of thin air, and here we are. But that is not what happened. Think of a currency like a restaurant reputation. Two restaurants both sell food, both take money, but one has a line out the door every night, and the other is half empty on a Saturday. Why? Because people trust one more. They believe the food is better. The experience is worth it. Currencies work exactly the same way. A dollar is not worth more than a yen because America decided so. It is worth more because the global market, millions of investors, governments, and businesses collectively trusts the American economy more on certain measures. More people want dollars. Higher demand means higher price.
When a country is growing, attracting investment, and keeping things stable, the world wants that currency. When a country is struggling, printing recklessly, or going through political chaos, the world sells it off fast. The exchange rate is just a live scoreboard, showing how much the world trusts each country's economy at any given moment. The number on the note is completely arbitrary. The economy standing behind it is everything. Why is every country in debt, and who do they owe? Every major country on Earth is carrying enormous debt. And if you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it starts to feel like a joke. If every country owes money, who exactly is getting paid? The answer is mostly each other and their own citizens. Governments borrow by selling something called bonds. A bond is a simple deal. You hand the government money today. The government promises to pay you back later with interest. It is an IOU with a schedule attached. Who buys these bonds? Ordinary people putting savings somewhere safe, banks holding them as reserves, pension funds investing your retirement money, and other governments, because lending to a stable country is one of the safest investments in the world. So when one country owes billions to another, that second country likely owes billions right back to someone else. The whole system is a web of mutual lending held together by one thing: trust, that everyone keeps paying their interest. And here is the key insight most people miss. Governments do not need to pay off the debt. They just need to manage it. As long as the economy keeps growing and generating tax revenue, they can keep rolling the debt forward, selling new bonds to pay off old ones indefinitely. Debt only becomes a real crisis when lenders stop believing they will be paid back. Until that moment, it is just how modern governments operate, all of them, without exception. Why can't we just print more money? This is the question that sounds almost too obvious to ask. Government needs money. Government can print money. So why not just run the machines? Solve poverty, pay off every debt, and call it done. Because money is not wealth. Money is a receipt for wealth, and printing more receipts does not create more of what the receipts represent. Here is a simple way to picture it. Imagine a small town with one bakery. The bakery makes 100 loaves of bread per day. Each loaf costs $1. Now imagine the government doubles everyone's money overnight. Suddenly, everyone has twice as much cash, but the bakery still makes 100 loaves. It cannot magically bake 200. So what happens? The baker raises prices. Now each loaf costs $2. Nobody is better off. They just need twice as much money to buy the same bread. That is inflation. More money chasing the same amount of goods means each unit of money buys less. The currency gets diluted. The extra money does not add value. It just spreads the existing value thinner. Governments can create money, but only safely when the real economy is growing to match it. More goods, more services, more productive output. Without that growth behind it, printing money does not solve financial problems. It just delays them and charges interest while it waits. What is Bitcoin? Bitcoin is money that no single person, company, or government controls. There is no central bank managing it, no CEO making decisions about it, no government that can freeze it, inflate it, or shut it down. It runs on a network of computers all over the world, following rules written in code, and no single participant can change those rules unilateral. The foundation is something called the blockchain. Every time someone sends Bitcoin, that transaction is broadcast to thousands of computers simultaneously. Those computers verify, confirm it is legitimate, and add it to a permanent public record, a chain of every transaction that has ever happened.
visible to anyone, unchangeable by anyone acting alone. Your name is never attached to any. The ledger records that a transfer happened between two addresses. It does not say who owns those addresses, unless the owner chooses to reveal themselves. There is a hard limit on how many Bitcoin will ever exist, written into the original code and impossible to override. This scarcity is deliberate. It is why people compare it to gold. You cannot just make more of it. The weaknesses are real though. Transactions are slower than a card payment. The price swings wildly, making it impractical as day-to-day currency. And if you lose access to your wallet, nobody can help you. No customer service line, no account recovery. Gone. Bitcoin proved that a financial system can run on mathematics instead of institutional trust, whether that becomes the future of money or just the world's most complicated speculative asset. The mark is still decided. What happens when inflation goes negative? Falling prices sound like the dream. Everything gets cheaper every month. Your money goes further without you doing anything. Life just quietly becomes more affordable. But when prices fall consistently across an entire economy, when what economists call deflation sets in, the results are far more destructive than high inflation. The problem is completely rational human behavior at the worst possible scale. When prices are falling, people wait. Why buy a new laptop today if it will be cheaper in 3 months? Why sign a major contract now when the trend is downward? Individually, this makes total sense. But when millions of people make this exact same decision at the exact same time, demand across the entire economy collapses simultaneously. Businesses see sales fall. They cut prices further to attract buyers. That destroys their margins, so they cut costs, which means laying people off. Those people now have less income, so they spend less, which reduces demand further, which forces more businesses to cut prices, which causes more layoffs. The spiral feeds itself, going down. And debt makes everything worse during deflation. If you borrowed money to start a business, you still owe the same fixed amount, regardless of what happens to prices. But your revenue is shrinking because prices are dropping. The same debt becomes heavier and heavier relative to your ability to pay it. Defaults rise. Banks stop lending. Credit disappears. Inflation is painful. Deflation is paralysis. Economies need prices to rise slowly, just enough to keep people spending today rather than waiting for tomorrow. Falling prices feel like a gift. Economically, they function like a slow poison. Who actually pays the tariffs? When a government puts a tariff on foreign goods, the story sold to the public is usually about making other countries pay, punishing foreign competition, standing up for domestic workers. The foreign country pays nothing. Here is exactly what happens. A domestic company wants to import goods from abroad. The goods cost $1,000. The government adds a 25% tariff. The domestic company pays that extra $250 to their own government at the border. The foreign supplier receives exactly what they were always going to receive. They are completely untouched. Now, the domestic company has a decision to make: absorb that extra cost and watch their profits shrink, or pass it to customers through higher prices. Almost every business passes it on. Why would they voluntarily take the hit? And if that imported product is a raw material, steel, grain, chemical components, every single product made using it also gets more expensive. The cost does not stop at the border. It travels down the entire supply chain and quietly arrives in your shopping cart as a slightly higher price on the shelf. Tariffs have real uses. They can protect domestic industries from being undercut. They create leverage in trade negotiations, but they are not free. They function as a tax, and every tax, no matter how it is framed, ultimately lands with the person buying the product. The other country does not feel it. You do. Why can almost nobody afford to buy a home anymore? A generation ago, buying a home was a normal milestone, not a luxury, not something requiring a decade of sacrifice and a significant inheritance, just a thing that working people did when they were ready to settle down. Today, in most major cities, that sentence sounds like historical fiction. Several things went wrong at the same time, and they made each other worse. First, supply. Building homes is slow, expensive, and politically complicated. Zoning laws, planning restrictions, and neighborhood opposition mean new housing gets blocked,
delayed, or scaled down constantly. Population keeps growing. Housing supply does not keep up. When more people compete for the same limited number of homes, prices rise. Simple as that.
Second, investment demand. Property became an attractive financial asset. Institutional funds, wealthy individuals, and large property companies started buying homes, not to live in, but to hold and rent. First-time buyers trying to purchase a home to actually live in are now competing against organizations with vastly more capital. That is a competition most people cannot win. Third, cheap borrowing that backfired. When interest rates were very low, mortgages became cheaper, which sounds helpful, but what it actually meant was that buyers could borrow more. And when buyers can borrow more, they bid high. Sellers raised asking prices to match. When rates went back up, those inflated prices mostly stayed where they were, and wages did not keep up with any of it. The gap between what a typical income can afford and what a typical home costs has grown to the point where for many people, working harder or saving longer is not actually a solution. The numbers simply do not reach. What is the difference between trading and investing? Both involve putting money into financial markets. Both involve buying assets. And yet the two approaches are almost completely opposite in every way that matters. Trading is about capturing short-term price movement. A trader buys something because they think the price will go up in the next few hours or days and sells the moment it does. Or they bet it will fall and profit from that direction instead. The company behind the stock is almost irrelevant. What matters is which way the number is moving and how fast. Investing is about buying something you believe will be worth significantly more years from now. The investor does not care what the price does tomorrow. They care whether the underlying business is fundamentally good, growing, and durable. When markets crash, a trader panics. An investor looks at it as a sale and considers buying more. The difference in outcomes over time is stark. The vast majority of active traders, including professionals who do it full-time, fail to outperform a simple strategy of buying broad market funds and holding them for years. Timing the market consistently requires an edge that almost nobody has. Transaction costs, taxes on every trade, and the sheer time required eat into whatever gains are made. Investing rewards patience. Trading rewards skill, genuine, rare, hard-won skill. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people who believe they have that skill are about to learn an expensive lesson about how much they do not. How do rich people use debt to get richer? For most people, debt is something you accumulate when money runs out. A credit card balance growing quietly in the background. A loan you had no choice but to take. Something you are trying to escape from. For wealthy people, debt is a deliberate strategy. Something they choose. Something they use to make more money. Here is the basic logic. If your investments are growing at 8% per year and a bank will lend you money at 3% interest, borrowing is profitable. You pay 3 to access capital that earns you 8. The gap between those two numbers accumulates in your favor every single year, while you still own the underlying assets in full. Now add the tax dimension. If you sell assets to raise cash, you trigger a tax on the gains. But if you borrow against those assets instead, you get cash in hand without selling anything. No sale means no taxable event. You spend the borrowed money. Your assets keep growing. You pay back the loan gradually from returns or income. The tax bill never arrives. The reason this is only available to wealthy people is not malicious design. It is risk assessment. Banks offer these loan structures, secured against large asset portfolios, only to clients who already hold significant wealth. And they charge those clients far lower interest rates because the risk of default is low. How does money laundering actually work? Criminals make money. That part is obvious. The problem is that the money came from illegal activity, which means they cannot just deposit it in a bank, buy a house, or make any major financial move without someone immediately asking where it came from. Money laundering is the process of inventing a convincing, legal-looking answer to that question. It happens in 3 stages. The first stage is called placement. This is getting the dirty cash into the financial system at all. It is the riskiest moment because the money is still obviously connected to the crime. Common approaches include breaking large sums into smaller deposits spread across multiple accounts, converting cash into luxury goods or property, or mixing illegal funds into the cash flow of a legitimate business. to disguise them as regular revenue.
The second stage is called layering. The goal here is distance, creating so many transactions between the money and its origin that the trail becomes impossible to follow. Funds move through shell companies, cross international borders, get converted between currencies, flow in and out of multiple institutions. Each step buries the origin deep. After 10 transfers across 5 countries, the paperwork alone would take investigators years to untangle. The third stage is called integration. The money re-enters the legitimate economy looking completely clean. It appears as profits from a real business. Taxes get paid on it. It becomes indistinguishable from legal earnings. A restaurant reporting more sales than it ever actually made. A property sold at an inflated price between connected parties. A consulting fee for work that was never done. The system is not easy to defeat because the financial system processes an enormous volume of perfectly normal transactions every single day. Criminal money, distributed carefully enough, just blends into that noise.